Hello, I'm Barbara Georgiakli and this is Mandy Christopher from the Department of Primary Industries. My background is as a cropping researcher and I own a small farm in southeast Queensland.
I grew up on a cropping and sheep property in South Australia, and I've worked as a researcher in broadacre cropping for over 30 years.
We are both part of DPI's Carbon Outreach team, which is tasked with bringing independent advice to Queensland producers about emissions reporting and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, Mandy, can you explain how to go about calculating emissions for a broadacre farm?
For accounting purposes, greenhouse gas emissions are divided into three scopes. Scope 1 emissions are those produced on farm and directly controlled by the farmer. Scope 2 emissions are those produced by the generation of energy used on farm. Scope 3 emissions are upstream or downstream of your farm, including inputs like fertilisers and transport to market. Depending on what the emissions accounting is being used for, different combinations of these scopes are counted. For example, consumers who want to choose a low emissions product, they'll want to know the sum of emissions along the whole supply chain, Scope 1, 2 and 3. The Australian Government reports on our national emissions under the Paris Agreement by adding up all Scope 1 emissions from all the different industries that make up our economy.
This sounds complicated, but I guess they are all ways to see where we can reduce our emissions. But a reduction from what is the question? In most cases, it has been internationally agreed that the emissions baseline will refer to emissions from 2005. So, as an example, the emissions intensity baseline for the Australian grains industry is 315 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per tonne of grain produced. Carbon dioxide equivalents take into account that methane and nitrous oxide are much more potent greenhouse gases compared with carbon dioxide. Most producers will have this information on hand to calculate their greenhouse gas emissions. You need location, whether you are using irrigation or not, rainfall, grain yield, area sown, fertilizer type and rate, if any of the crop area was burnt, fuel and energy consumption and pesticide use.
So, here is an example of an emissions calculation tool, the University of Melbourne's GGAF. That's Grains Greenhouse Gas Accounting Framework tool. The University of Melbourne has many other tools for other crops like sugar and cotton, and for livestock, horticulture and fisheries. You can download the GAF tool so that no data sharing is required. This is the input page, so this is the only page that needs to be completed. By looking on the other tabs in the spreadsheet, you can see how this information is used to calculate your emissions. There's also an option in the GGAF tool to include trees on your property as sequesters of carbon. But for most carbon accounts, it doesn't count unless they're registered as a carbon project. There's also a tool to help work out the amount of different elements in your fertiliser if that's not listed on the packaging. The tool calculates total farm emissions as well as crop emissions intensity, showing the contributions of Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions from different sources and gases. So by understanding where your emissions are coming from, you can see where efforts to reduce emissions would be best directed. There are also calculators other than the GAF tools available online, so you should do some comparisons to see which is the best for you.
So in summary, emissions accounting can demonstrate efficient production and potentially low emission grain production. Select a calculator that best fits your needs. The data required includes fertilizer, pesticide, electricity and fuel use, and crop yield. The amount and type of fertilizers used has a large impact on broadacre emissions. To summarise the actions you could take now, make sure you are keeping the relevant records. Calculate your greenhouse gas emissions and emissions intensities. Have informed discussions with your buyers and bank about their expectations. And seek independent advice if you are considering carbon projects. Do you want to know more about this topic and what it means for you? We have produced several more of these videos addressing different aspects of what broadacre farmers need to know about greenhouse gases and emissions accounting.
The Carbon Outreach Project is funded through the Farm Business Resilience Program, which is jointly funded by the Australian and Queensland governments. We'd also like to acknowledge the University of Melbourne that produced many of the education materials we drew on for this presentation.